Well, welcome everyone to week 8. We'll since we're going to do 2 classes this week, probably week 8A and 8B here, but we will be covering chapter, chapter 10 tonight, which talks about crime and cyber risk. Most of this material is actually very similar to what the old ARM 55 course had. They had it broken up a little bit. And actually next week when we go to chapter 11, which will be the final chapter, we'll be talking about fleet risk management, and that's an area that I also enjoy quite a bit. So what you'll notice is some of the slides I incorporated from the old ARM book, and there's some graphs that I think they should have included in this textbook to make life a little easier for everyone. And so there'll be at least some slides you'll probably want to maybe pull out and use just for your own studying purposes. The other thing to keep in mind about as we go through this chapter is, for the most part, you're going to think, well, this is common sense, or maybe you'll think, oh, that's why IT wants me to change my password every 6 weeks, or things like that. And hopefully people had a chance to take a look at the video that I sent out late last week regarding from Risk Summit. Kent Wada that did a presentation on privacy issues, and but it wasn't necessarily directly, it's somewhat related to IT. You kind of get an idea of where privacy issues come in, and as part of that discussion on cyber risk of how people can use data, and how companies are really starting to use data as part of that. And it's quite amazing now when you think about the NSA stuff of how they're able to data mine, and there's discussions about with like 3 pieces of information that can create pretty much a whole profile on who you are now, what your purchase habits are, and also the fact that we pretty much give up almost all this information voluntarily. The reality is with Facebook and everything else, we really provide a great deal of information about what we like, what we don't like. If we have the GPS indicator on our phone, it basically says where we visit, where we live, and provides a lot of information to various people. So that's the one part of it. The other thing I think it's also to keep in mind, and this is not necessarily part of the course per se, but that one of the reasons why their IT or workplaces are so concerned about changing the passwords, it's not so much that of getting access. Someone gets access to a Facebook account. Well, I go, big deal. Well, the problem is most likely the password that you use for Facebook is the same one you might use for your bank account, for your credit card, for your mortgage, and everything else, because most people don't have a separate password for each and every account. And that's one of the concerns, is that while it might be someone might have gotten a password from a very who cares type of account, it could certainly have an impact and allow people to access business work type of accounts as well. So that's part of the reason why there's just such a concern with IT security of having the passwords changed and not using an old password, of one of the last 5. I mean, there's all these type of security things that go into play there. So with that background, we'll go ahead and get started with the rest of the class tonight. So as far as the objectives, again, fairly short and simple. Describe distinctive features of crime risk and their implications for risk management, and describe some of the characteristics of common crimes. And when we talk about the common crimes that they list is, burglary, robbery, vandalism, espionage, some of those type of features. Explain how to use risk-controlled measures against those crime losses, and explain how an organization can have cyber risk loss exposures in each of the following categories. And so property, net income, and liability. The idea being that cyber risk can affect more than just the idea of technology and having hackers go in, but it can actually affect some of these other type of items. And then how can organizations control or finance their cyber risk exposures? And then finally, a new section which they didn't have in the old textbook was a discussion on social media risk and ways to control it. So that is also something that's relatively new, at least in the insurance world and from a risk management standpoint of how do you deal with those type of situations. So when we talk about crime risk, the first thing is, crime is an act, or in some cases a failure act, that violates the rights of individuals and organizations. And when we think about, a crime can result in property, personnel, liability, or net income losses. So if we think about crime and we go into some of the common crimes of vandalism, well, that's, it's property damage possibly. Broken windows could be, property damage. From a personnel standpoint, well, if you're a convenience store and, you have employees working at night, they have the possibility of being assaulted as part of a robbery. And that can then be part of the personnel risk that's associated with it. And then as well as from a liability or net income, in most cases, as soon as you, have to pay for, again, think of net income being anything where you have to spend more money or you're losing revenue, that's a net income loss. In most cases, any type of loss is going to also involve a net income loss. And then the other issue is that hostile intent is one of the distinctive features of criminal loss exposure, and we'll talk a little bit more about hostile intent here. So a crime is not a result of an accident, negligence, or natural event. It is an intentional act. The idea that someone is, intending to do harm, that, it's one thing to, if you say march in the streets, it's another thing as soon as they cross the line that, that to damage property or do something else, there's certainly that hostile intent now that's part of it. And so part of the issues is that risk control measures really need to include, to address some of the hostile intent of those. It's one thing to say, okay, for trip and falls, we're going to do some things to prevent that. Well, that you can do all you want with, making sure your sidewalks don't have, lips, that people can trip over and other things, but you also need to protect against those people that are really intending to do harm to your organization. So if you take example, so buses are fleet risk. If I'm an operator for, in this area, AC Transit is one of the public transit. There's certain things I want to protect against of, people tripping and falling as they're getting up on the steps or those type of things. In some locations, you'll find that there's actually plexiglass barriers between the driver and the public. So that way they can't get hit or punched. I mean, actually the number of assaults on bus drivers is actually quite high in certain areas. So that would be something you'd have to consider. Or what about the theft of money that's in the machines in which they collect? That could be a potential risk. From a fleet, kind of looking at what we're doing next week with fleet, okay, where the buses are stored. Could someone decide to do some graffiti on the buses, slash tires, all those type of things. So that's part of what we talk when we talk about hostile intent. And typically criminals, with that in mind, they're going to be going for certain types of targets, high value, easily transported items. So obviously the higher the value, so jewelry, those type of things, that's why jewelry stores are such a high risk, is because it's a high value item that can be sold and easily transported, as well as money. Can be, certainly has a high value on it. Locations that are unguarded, so unguarded property. If there's no fences around, there's no, lighting has an issue. One of the things that they didn't really talk about in the book is something called CPTED, which stands for Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. And the idea through crime prevention through environmental design is that you can build, how your buildings are constructed, your landscaping. There's certain things you can do that in some cases may not involve, putting up additional lighting, but it could just be how the visibility, that you want to make sure that shrubs aren't blocking where people can see, see things. If you have a lot of corners in areas that, where people can't see someone walk around a corner, you'll notice bus stops nowadays, they're actually clear. The standard design for bus stop locations is to make them more visible, so if someone was getting assaulted, that you'd be able to see what was going on, and there's less likely to have those type of events there.
Bike racks over at the, they're starting to put bike racks out in front of buildings instead of hiding them out behind, in the back of the garage where somebody could take all the time they wanted to cut a lock. No one was going to come by and see them. Now you're in front of the building. There's a sidewalk there, people walking by.
And actually, there's another good point that I think goes into one of the big concerns that you're seeing with a lot of infill development within cities is, especially Sacramento is a good example, is typically in business districts, you have a lot of people there during the day, but as soon as everyone leaves, and if there's no residential areas, you completely have free for all because there's no one watching. And so what you're seeing a lot more, and in the city areas is you see, what they call it, live lofts, I think is the right term for it, where you have a business down below and you have people living up above. So you have natural crime prevention. You have, essentially, you have people on the street that can help identify or help, kind of keep the streets a little more busy with more eyes out on the street. So all these are really principles. So from a public agency standpoint, or from a city, the type of development that I want to have will also influence where crime might occur. And typically you see more crime in industrial areas in some cases just because there's really not a population out there, and depending on how it's guarded and those type of things. So we've got the second one, unguarded property. Vulnerable people would certainly be another crime target. Vulnerable people meaning that they're working alone in some cases, and that's where bus drivers, when they're driving alone on a rural route, might have more of an exposure. Cab drivers, would certainly have a higher exposure. They're picking people up that they don't know, taking them places, where they may not be that familiar with. So that's a vulnerability. And then unprotected key operations. So when we talk about unguarded property, that's one issue, but operations of, that would be security, access to certain types of buildings, things like that. It goes beyond just having fences and security cameras. So one of the things a company should do is part of helping with when you're dealing with people with hostile intent. And this isn't necessarily in this was from the old textbook, but hire persons who are not accustomed or inclined to commit crimes. Okay, well, how do you do that? Well, that's through the background checks. It's through, making sure, some organizations have psychological exams or certain things that they'll require people to take. Treating employees fairly. By treating employees fairly, they're less likely to steal from the company. Resolve grievances promptly and equitably. Terminate or take other appropriate action against employee commits crime. Now, the reason why that's important is that if someone gets away with it or they hear about things, the culture becomes, oh, Joe got away with it, so I can, it's not a big deal. They didn't do anything to him. Now, of course, there's certain things you're not going to be able to publicize from a discipline standpoint, but I can tell you, at least from some organizations I worked for in the past, like Work Comp Fraud, they made it very visible, and so it became a public, in the public type of domain to where they could say this happened. And so people were aware that work comp fraud was not going to be tolerated. Employees and their supervisors report situations that could lead to criminal violence at work. That's more behavioral intervention techniques. And supervisor and manager should also possess the skills to help employees resolve dilemmas constructively and peacefully. And that's one of the big issues I think most organizations have is supervisors and managers aren't necessarily trained or given the skill set to address those situations. And on here, we're really talking in many ways more hostile, work environment type of issues where other employees have an opportunity to prevent a crime internally than anything else when we talk about these. So we start from an evaluation standpoint, how do we, start looking some of our risk control efforts. So one of the things we need to do is determine weaknesses in our process. So, where's the potential for crime that we might have in it? So, if we have a fire detection system, some of the things they talk about in the book is, an evaluation of our processes is that if employees know that the fire protection system doesn't work and I'm a disgruntled employee, then, hey, if I, set a fire, the building's going to go up because the sprinklers aren't going to go off. Or if there's a known, internal controls in cash handling. If you basically just say, okay, the till's done and the person counts and there's no double counting the second verification and there's no controls in that, then you're more likely to have theft occur. Working for Raley's, the cash handling, as far as people counted in their tills, when they got them, they counted out to the penny, they go back in, it gets counted again by the bookkeeper. If there's a discrepancy, then they start looking for what happened. And typically, discrepancy, of probably I'd say under, $5, things can happen. But then they start looking for other factors, and they start looking for trends. That if they continually are missing $20 all the time, then they start, there's ways they can determine, what shift is, who's working these shifts, what's happening, and they start putting up cameras. and then they'll identify who that person was if there's a theft situation. Ordering an inventory process. That if there's gaps in the process of that, people, if you're not doing inventory, how do you know if you've lost any product or lost any materials? So if you don't have some type of tracking system and people can just continue to order, then you'll have that. Now, there's a story actually with Raley's in the print shop. The person there was actually got prosecuted now for, I guess, I don't know if it'd be embezzlement, I guess is probably the correct term. He was ordering printing material and printing, using the company's printing. He had his own company which he was printing and charging people outside of the Raley's environment. And so he was basically using Raley's material, ordering paper from Raley's, wasn't paying any dollars back to reimburse the company, and yet was making money off of people doing, under this business name. And the company did go after him, and I don't know if he's in jail, but I know that they did go after him criminally, or they sent it to the DA. So one of the primary focuses of the efforts when you look at these things is to shield the organization's assets and activities by maintaining physical, procedural, and managerial barriers that reduce criminal opportunities. And so as we're going to go through some different elements, again, some of these aren't necessarily in the book, but I think it'll be helpful to kind of give you the conceptual aspect of what are the procedural things you could do for robbery or espionage. The other aim is to reduce criminals' perceptions that they can commit crimes against the organization without being detected with legal impunity. So essentially, where that goes is that, okay, let's say there's a potential for fraud of people's slip and fall claims. As I mentioned, I think in the past, Raley's had a very, rigorous program with sweep sheets. So anyone that claimed a slip and fall, they would defend it basically to the end, so that way people knew that they weren't going to get away with, with being able to do that. And same thing with undercover loss prevention agents. That basically the word gets out that, hey, they've got loss prevention agents that are going to, go after you. Now, the other aspect, as much as people like, the Walmart greeters, and they kind of say, oh, well, that's nice to have them, their purpose is not to reach you. Their purpose is crime prevention. And so even though, Aunt or Uncle Jim might be out there greeting and stuff, what they're doing is they're saying, are you bringing anything that you could stuff stuff into? And that they're checking things out. And if you look, a little leery or those type of things, then they'll all have security say, hey, you want to watch this person, and then they start tracking you. And if you ever notice in a Walmart store, there's cameras all over the place. And so they have a very rigorous crime prevention aspect. So even though, you can package it different ways, but the other thing is when you have people in a grocery store or other locations that are constantly walking saying, hi, how you doing, anything I can help you with? Again, it's a good customer service aspect. But the more that people get talked to while they're in the store, if they're intending to do a crime, they pretty much realize that they're not going to be able to do it because another person's going to come up and greet them, and they're not going to have the opportunity to do that. So they're looking for locations that aren't well staffed, that don't have some of these measures in place. And so, again, that's where risk management gets involved as part of these efforts. So the one thing, this is not in the book really either, but I think it's also just in general a good thing from a conceptual standpoint to understand is crime risk models. That as you start looking as an organization, depending on where you're going to do business, you can actually get access to crime data. And it'll tell you how many robberies, how many assaults, all those type of things, thefts are in an area. And so almost any police department you can request to see a map of where certain crimes are, and especially now with technology, it's probably a lot easier to produce. But that way, if you have a better idea of what types of crimes are occurring, there are certain places where maybe you have more auto thefts are occurring, things like that. It'll help determine what kind of resources you need. It also might justify some of the, saying we need cameras here, we need these things before a theft does occur. The downside is they're ineffective if there's scarce data. You know, and usually with more serious crimes, you're not going to have as much data, especially in smaller areas. But in like a city of in Oakland, you'll certainly have an aspect of, okay, you're going to know where the crime areas are, where things are more likely to happen, where the police always being called out for certain types of disturbances. Now, this is the one chart that's not in this textbook, but this was in the old 55 textbook, and this is the one that I would certainly, so this is slide 9, that you'll want to go ahead and probably print this one slide out, if nothing else, to keep for studying. Because what's nice about it talks about burglary and what's the characteristics of a burglary, breaking into out of a closed building, taking tangible property. So for robbery, what they'll do is if all these things are talked about in the paragraphs that are in there, but it's nice that in the old textbook they distilled it to one easy to read spot. There most likely will be a question between what's the difference between burglary and robbery, because they're very, you know, because they're pretty close. And you know, where, you know, robbery, where the difference between a burglary and robbery is that taking tangible property by force or by threat of force from someone else, whereas burglary is you're just breaking in and stealing stuff, you know, into a closed building that's not open for business to commit a crime. So again, the difference is really taking by force, but there'll be some type of thing which this definition describes what kind of crime. So just be aware that you'll probably have something on there like that. The other thing is that you'll probably have some, from questions, we're going to go through some of these, and you know, what are some of the procedural, physical barriers and managerial barriers that you can use to prevent some of these types of crimes. So we're going to go through some of these and a little bit more description where it describes. So burglary is the breaking into a locked building with the intent to commit felony. Burglary is the intent of force breaking into or out of a building. And many measures focus on protecting the boundaries or perimeter of a building of an area. So the idea is that if the perimeter is not breached, no burglary occurred. And that's, you know, for some reason I remember there's going to be some question about if the perimeter is not breached. Again, this is one area where they kind of get a little technical or get a little into the weeds, I think, on some of the questions possibly. A robbery is taking a personal property from persons with violence or threat of violence. And the safety of personnel and customers is usually the major concern during a robbery. So if you think about from a risk control measure, you know, if you have a robbery, what are some of the safeguards you want to put in place? How do you protect, again, your employees as well as the customers during those times? Shoplifting, I think most of us know that, unlawful removal of merchandise out of the store. And so how do we do that? You know, security tags, cameras, undercover security personnel. Technology's gotten better now with, I think they even put those little RF little things where as you're walking out, you know, if you had a you know, printer ink, there are certain things that they know are higher theft, so they're going to put them up. They're going to, if you notice in certain stores, they lock up the higher end scotch and, you know, other type of liquors, you know, because again, that's it's an easy item. It's a high value item for certain people. It's easy to transport. They can put it in their jacket and they can walk out quickly. So the most common items that are stolen in a grocery store is alcohol and cigarettes. If you consider a carton of cigarettes now is $40 or something like that. And that's why you find nowadays they're always behind the counter or they're locked. It used to be that they used to be on the shelves and anyone could just grab and put it in there. That's not the case anywhere, I don't think, anymore, to where that can happen. Just as a side note, the other high theft item, diapers. They used to be high theft item. Not necessarily easy to get under your coats or jackets, but those are showing. And the other high theft item now, or at least a while ago, because of the thefts, is what do I want to call it? The medicine or the counter medication, like pseudoephedrine, basically because it can just make meth. So that's also now behind the counter where you have to basically give your whole address and life story to even get some allergy medication. Efforts to combat shoplifting can also at the same time create potential liability. So this is one of the concerns that's talked about. A shoplifter confronted too aggressively may become violent, and you have that personnel loss. And then also if someone is wrongfully accused of shoplifting, that person would have a valid tort claim for defamation, assault, wrongful imprisonment, or malicious prosecution. And so usually loss prevention agents, actually, they go through quite a bit of training, and which requires that they have to keep the eye on the person at all times to make sure they didn't, if they know that they took something, if they lose sight of them at any one point in time, to where the person may have an opportunity to put the product back, usually they won't stop them because of that issue of that they could get sued for not doing it correctly. Some other types of fraud is theft by trickery, falsehood, or deception, which causes another organization to relinquish money, property, or legal rights for another's benefit without fair compensation. So deceiving someone into surrendering money or his or her right to property is considered fraud. Internet commerce normally expands the global horizon for fraud. So the idea of if I go on eBay and my daughter wants Uggs, and wow, normally Uggs costs $120, but hey, I can get it from this one site for $60. What a deal. Well, most likely they're not real Uggs, but if they try to, no, they are, say they're legitimate, all those things, you could go after them for fraud. The problem is most likely they're not even in the country where those things are being sold, and they're being shipped, and so they're not going to be able to do any recovery for buying a fraudulent pair of Uggs or any other type of material. Fraud would also be, again, it would be selling products, it would be misrepresenting certain types of things, which could be part of that fraud element. Some of the other ways can be committed against an organization. Company pays in advance for goods the seller knows will not be delivered or will be inferior. Company sells and delivers goods or services to a customer who has no intention of paying for them. An inventor sells all rights to an invention that the inventor knows has been developed and patented by another person. And then, another authorized person acquired and uses an account number, PIN number, or other identifying information. So unauthorized use of, debit cards, that would be obviously fraud there. It's probably not going to go into too much detail about specific elements, but it gives you an idea of what things you may want to look at, of what may constitute fraud. Embezzlement is fraud against the company by abusing the trust or operating procedures. And typically it is going to be an employee or agent acting in a fiduciary capacity. So in other words, an embezzlement is, a checker that, or cashier that ends up stealing money, a bookkeeper, an accountant. That's where the embezzlement comes from, because in this case, they're abusing the trust or the operating, they're violating that. And so it's not just theft, it's, they're working in a different capacity. And it could also involve a group of employees, collusion with each other. So, and that's why controls are so important, that you have really a separation. If you have people that are handling cash, whether it be a bank or other things, there's very strict procedures on people, how cash is handled, who counts it, where it's located, all those type of things are very, and then there's cameras all over the place in the event that there's an issue that if someone didn't get money, the correct change or something like that. Some of the measures to prevent embezzlement: doing background checks, strictly enforcing the organization's procedures, and again that goes more to the internal controls, and promptly addressing any violated procedures. If someone didn't do something right, they took a shortcut, is to make sure people understand, maybe it was, whether it was intentional or not, in some cases it could be by accident, but really reinforcing through memos or other things, this is the way we're going to do it. Or if you find a problem with your procedures, to make sure that that's corrected as quickly as possible. Forgery and counterfeiting involves presenting false documents or artwork as genuine in order to commit fraud. And so obviously counterfeiting, most people, that deals with currency. So control measures, verifying the authenticity of currency or documents. So a lot of organizations now, to limit that risk, you'll notice that they won't take anything above the 50. In some places they won't take anything above the 20. The reason being that most of the time it's, if they're going to, people aren't going to counterfeit $1 bills or $5 bills because it's such, the amount of time it takes. It's more likely going to be a $20 bill. Some of the challenges now, especially on counterfeiting, is with all these great printers that we have, they can look pretty close to, good duplication, and that's where the, the issue of the type of paper being used, and so there's all those things that go in there. And so you have the pins, you have little things you can hold them under, all these things, look and hold them up, and so that would be, so that's where you're seeing more of that. And so especially for those that do take cash. Now, to help prevent some of the fraud issues with dealing with cash. Some organizations, so if you look at Southwest or most airlines, they don't accept cash on flights anymore. They don't want to deal with the internal controls of having to do the accounting, and so they say we'll swipe the credit card, or we'll take a coupon or whatever. And so that's one way they get out of the theft issue or having to worry about the theft issue. Now, they could, one of the issues they may have, I don't know if it'd be a theft, is okay, all the little bottles of liquor, that has a certain value, so they have probably some internal controls to make sure how many bottles did they have when they did the plane, so that they just don't know if someone just didn't take a whole bunch off or those type of things. Vandalism involves maliciously defacing, damaging, or destroying others' property. I think most people recognize vandalism around. Arson, damaging through fire for the purpose of personal gain without legal purpose.
Does that mean it wouldn't be arson if there was no financial gain? That seems a little odd. I can imagine somebody motivated by malice.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the way the book described it is that I think it's typically from. I think there might be from an insurance standpoint. I think that's the way to describe arson. I'll have to take a look on that one, but I think that's more from, typically because it's something that's arson. If it was intentionally done to my own property for my insurance benefits, it would be denied. If it's determined that someone else burned it because I asked them to for my own benefit, that would also be denied if it was discovered. Now, because some things can be arson that are just, someone that decided to burn down a building and I have no idea, there's no relationship, I think it's still considered arson, but there was, at least from an insurance standpoint, no financial gain in that. But I'll have to double check on that one. But typically, it's more from an insurance standpoint. Terrorism, this is something that was added new to the book, but involves use of violence, intimidation, or threats to influence others' behavior off political purposes. And so there's certain organizations that are going to be more likely targets of terrorism than others. Most, small organizations are going to have to deal with this. But if you're an airline or if you're Disneyland, some major operation, or where a lot of public, or it's a an icon of some sort, Hollywood, obviously New York, there's certain areas that are going to be more likely targets of terrorism. And then espionage involves finding and obtaining confidential information by personal observation or mechanical or electronic technology that thwarts the efforts to protect the information's confidentiality. And so espionage, I think there's a movie that's coming out that, one person's working for another company and, trying to get corporate secrets. And so, espionage, we think of spying more from, probably from, national security standpoint, but espionage really involves more commonly is someone trying to gain trade secrets from another organization to their benefit. And then computer crimes, and we'll go more into cyber risk specifically, but involves damage or using computer hardware or software to achieve a legal purpose. And a lot of times can involve embezzlement, espionage, fraud, terrorism. When we think about computer crimes, getting emails where it has trade secrets, those type of things, hacking in, identity theft, extortion, destruction of competitive advantage, all these things can be part of that. Measures include physical, procedural, management controls on computers' access, along with aggressive persecution and investigation of persons suspected of committing those crimes. And we'll talk more about what some of those physical barriers are to protect some data. So some of the more common computer crimes are going to be, I'm not going to go through all these. Those are in the book. But I think, again, I don't think that the text, the exam will necessarily go through this. But just an idea of, what some of these things are that might fall in the categories. So computer sabotage, fraud, embezzlement, computer network breach, theft through hacking, theft of data storage system, and theft of computer time. And that's a new one that they didn't have until there. But the idea of, from a theft of computer time, is that when people are doing stuff at work and they're on Facebook all day and not doing work, that could be considered, and you're paying them, that could be considered a theft of computer time, the way they described it. A denial of service, okay, actually that's theft of computer time there, and espionage is part of that as well. So some of the things we're going to do to control crime losses, the goal of the measures is to deter, detect, and deny. And so that's one thing, is really the 3 Ds you want to memorize when we talk about how do we prevent some of the crime losses. So deter, detect, and deny. And our loss prevention focuses really on the deterrence and detection aspect. What can we do, as far as, making it seem like people won't want to do it, or we'll be able to find out when they did try to do it, and so they're more likely to not try to steal things. Loss reduction focuses on reducing the severity of the crimes that do occur by denying criminal chance of causing a larger loss. So the idea being that they won't be able to, they might be able to break in, but they're not going to be able to get as much data that they, or if they want to do, again, this is where, sprinkler systems, they want to, try to light the building on fire, but because of the sprinklers, not so much damage is going to occur because of the fire protection systems in place. So that would be a loss reduction effort as well. We'll go through some of these more in detail. So crime risk control measures that focus on deterrence and detection include, looking at personnel policies. So what we're looking at when we talk about personnel policies, who we hire. It might, in certain personnel policies, it might require background checks. Certain positions may require, other type of, high security positions that might be through a contract, other things that they'll do more monitoring. They may follow employees. They may, they're going to be, checking other type of records, of what the employee's doing if they have some concerns. Physical controls, a lot of those, when we talk about physical controls, that could be, gates and cameras and things like that. Procedural, or just as they sound, procedural, what are the steps we're going to take, accounting procedures, those type of things. Managerial controls, we'll talk, managerial controls are a little unique, but the idea is that supervisors and managers, of, how they treat people, some of the things of, the regular walking, talking to employees, some of those things are some of the managerial controls. And lastly, the investigation and prosecution of crimes as being a deterrent as well. So when we talk about sound personnel required policy, we're talking about background checks on potential employees. We talked earlier about treating employees fairly. That helps with that process. Trying to resolve grievances promptly. And terminate or specify other appropriate action against an employee who commits crimes against the company. So basically taking action and letting not things linger for a longer period of time. And so the personnel policies of someone that could potentially do some harm as part of that. So in a university environment, because of Penn State, most most universities now in California, we have the CANRA policy, which now requires that those in certain types of positions are now required, that they're reporters, that they have to report if they see potential child abuse, those type of things. So now that's expanded the role of those that are required to report, now include really football coaches and those that are working with youth. And that's partly because of that. If I'm, I'm the safety officer for Little League. So we have people that work with youth, concerned when we talk about crimes, and a lot of times we think about that. But now one of the concerns we have from that standpoint is, well, who's working with the kids? What's the potential for a crime to occur there? If someone's working with young people. Some of the physical controls that a lot of times we think of, but and this is in general when we think of physical controls, almost for any type of crime prevention, alarms, which can serve as a deterrent. Although their primary function is to detect and potentially reduce the loss, there's certain types of alarms. You can have a perimeter system that has electrical contacts or metal tapes on windows, doors, or other openings. So a lot of people with their homes, they might have ADT or some other service. So as soon as the window is opened, or if you're a grocery store, they might have the contacts. If the door reaches a certain point, the alarm goes off, and so that would be a perimeter system. A sensing device, those are going to be buttons or foot pads connected to alarms. So in a banking situation, they're going to have a panic alarm. And again, in the grocery environment, the office would have a panic button as well as one check stand. Typically, that was most commonly used all the time at night, would also have a panic button. So that way, if and it's a silent alarm connected directly to a location. One time, I can say that when I was working, someone did hit accidentally the alarm, and within under 3 minutes, we had people on bullhorns asking us to put our hands up and walk out the building, essentially. So the good news is that it did work, and if nothing else, we have good. We know that that the device, they did respond very quickly in that whole situation. There's also interior alarm systems, and then also centralized alarm systems that may directly connect to an alarm company, and it will be monitored all hours. So if there is an alarm that goes off, goes to central station, in which then they'll call and say, hey, is everything okay? If they don't get a response, then they will send the police, and usually fire will respond as well. There's also automatic alarms that talks about in the book. The downside of sometimes automatic is that if you get a lot of false alarms, there's certain locations where the police start charging for false alarms for each one you have, because if your system's maybe either too sensitive, the police are going to say, I'm not going to come anymore, and then that also probably reduces your response time as part of that. Other physical controls, you might have watchmen or guards, that would regularly walk. And a lot of times you'll have multiple, you'll have all these things in place. You'll have the alarms, you'll have a watchman, you'll have cameras, locks, bars, and safes. So, as you walk down, so working in downtown Oakland, walking past Chinatown, there's, several banks. They've got all these things. They've got the cameras. They've got a person out front. The door, you have to be buzzed in. There's bars all over, especially on the jewelry stores. So these are some of the measures they put in place to help protect them. Now, some of these things, by doing that, will also, from an insurance standpoint, say, okay, you put in all these protections. We're going to give you a better rate on your coverage because you've done some of these things. Some of the other specific risk control measures against burglary and robbery, and some of the things we've already talked about. Place marked cash and other property in vaults or safes to help trace and identify burglars. Okay. Again, I think most grocery stores do this. There's actually in a safe, there is a, those typically within the safe, there's a weight trigger. If you lift up, that if you lift up that cash, the alarm will go off, and we're sending a silent alarm to the police to come. And usually it has a tracer in that as well. So these things are not publicized. Usually when a grocery store is robbed, they try to keep it under wraps. They don't want it to get in the news, because of some of the concerns there of public perception. But usually it's a lot of things are going on that the public may not realize. But a lot of these protections have been put in place because it is an area where most likely people do it. So, if the idea is, as a grocery store, they can have the cash in the till, because the part of the procedures are after cash gets up to a certain point, they're supposed to drop their cash, and a lot of the check stands will drop things that have which the checkers don't have keys to, and there's reasons for that. And then they have a person that walks out with another person, so they have two people, and then they put all that money in the safe. So. So again, hey, if you get $500, that's fine, but you also have to realize most grocery stores pull in about $80,000 a day. So there's a huge sum of cash that could potentially be in there. And so if they try to get that, that's a way to alleviate some of those things. So some of the other things, when we talk about institute procedural controls, SOPs, standard operating procedures, 2 people counting a till, auditing. Having, as much as people, may not like the auditing practice, every year as a school district, almost every government agency is required to have an audit. And what they're looking for is they're auditing against, GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles. Are they following the standard process of when you have a receipt for travel, show me the documentation that you have the receipts, and they'll take a certain sample of files, and if they see the process are being followed, then basically get a clean bill of health. Some other procedural controls might be building access. So having the cards, or for those people that visit the OP building, I have a person into a visitor system. They sign in, they have to show their ID, we have to say what the business purpose is. I get an email when the people arrive, those type of things. So that could be part of the business of building access to ensure, and also a checkout system that when the people check out, they can tell who's in the building, essentially, checking in and checking out. So in the managerial controls that talks about are, obviously applicant screening. When we talk about education, that could be, more the training people on what the concerns are. Rotation of employees. As a manager, I probably want to rotate the employees that are doing different tasks occasionally. So because once someone gets comfortable in a position after a while and no one else, kind of knows what the routine is, they're more likely to be able to get away with something. And by rotating, it also will help determine, hey, when John works, we're always missing $100. We don't see that when other people are. So that's why rotation is a key element of that. Obviously, from a managerial or owner standpoint, investigate and prosecute the crimes, which will help reduce the scale of crimes. And then also talks about implementing post-crime rapid recovery. And we'll talk a little bit more about what some of those type of elements are. So here's some more detail about each one of these things that you can do. And this is something that that wasn't necessarily in the book as much. It was in the old text, but which I think might be helpful. It gives you some context of what would you do in these circumstances. So for burglary, physical controls, fences, lighting alarms, locks, vaults, surveillance cameras. Procedural controls would be training, limit access to combinations to safes, develop and practice procedures. The other thing with procedural controls from a burglary standpoint, you're more likely to have theft from employees than you are to have it from people outside. The combination to the safe was regularly changed. The code to the alarm was regularly changed in a grocery store. That's pretty standard for almost all organizations. There's always going to be changes, so that way if someone did leave or something like that, as soon as the procedure was that if someone was in a managerial position that left, that went even to another store, the combo changed, because otherwise that person could come back and have access and no one knows that they had access and stole stuff. Managerial controls inform employees about burglary hazards, so let them know that there's a concern if they see something suspicious. One of the managerial controls also, if you're a large grocery store, if you notice, and it's after a certain hour, they close one side of the door. They kind of block it, and so there's only one way in and one way out. And that way they can see people coming in and out, and if they have a concern, it also prevents if someone needs to get out quick, that they're going to have to, they're not going to be able to get to the closest exit necessarily either. So that would be somewhat of a procedural control. Keep records of burglary losses. That's to kind of see, what the potential is, and, if there's not a lot of data there. And also include loss control and performance standards. Are people able to detect, and when we talk about that, the amount of shrink, things like that might be part of that. Physical controls from robberies, basically the same. Procedural controls, decrease the amount of cash on hand. Okay, well I mentioned that with how cashiers, they'll have to drop money at certain times. If you ever notice on procedural wise, I don't know if this is ever true, but they put it on cab. The cab driver carries no more than $20 of change. I think they usually carry more, but the idea is if someone sees that, they're going to go, oh, it's not worth me trying to rob this guy because he's not going to have the change on him. Run bank routes at different time in different streets. Okay, so one thing you'll notice is when I'm trying to think of a Fargo or whatever courier service that picks up money, they don't come at the same time every day. There's a reason why they don't come at the same time. They try to vary the routes in which they're going for that very reason, because they're more likely a target if they continue to go. If they know at 12 o'clock every day they're going to be here, they just create a target. Post signs, employee has no access to safe. Okay, and again, that kind of says, okay, the person can't view it, or there's time locks that even at certain times you can open the safe. So, the concern is, well, the employee, they're going to maybe harm an employee because of that. Usually, people that are trying to steal stuff, they're not going to want to hurt someone. They're just trying to get cash. And if the person really, says, look, I don't, those are some of the, but that can be a concern for employees. Managerial controls, background checks, again, educate employees, assist law enforcement with the persecution of those. Shoplifting, surveillance cameras, undercover security, magnetic tags, we kind of talked about some of those things. So when you walk through, it beeps as you start going out. Procedural controls, again, screen job applicants, train employees. Again, more likely the theft, even for shoplifting, is more likely going to be employees. than it is going to be the general public. Managerial controls create team combat atmosphere, assist with prosecution. And what it talks about that create the team is that, hey, that people are aware that we have loss control, we have other people that can help prevent that. From fraud, control access to premises, surveillance cameras, procedural controls, transfer and rotate employees, have regular audits, and check for proper ID. Now, from a fraud standpoint, it's also people passing bad checks. Those type of things can actually, I can honestly say at one point when I was in management, I got burned for $400. The check, because normally what the process is you have procedures that if it's over a certain amount, you can call the bank and you can verify if there's sufficient funds. Person had the ID, there's sufficient funds in there. Turns out the guy copied the bottom barcodes on an account and looked totally legit. And so it's one of those things where even if you call and you do all those things, you can still get burned. And so that's why certain checks now they won't even accept. Let someone else let the bank take the risk. So a lot of locations won't do that. Again, managerial controls, train manager, employees, and prosecute. Embezzlement, lock doors, cameras, install vaults and safes. Anyways, you guys are getting the idea here. And so these are just some of the things you want to take a look at to have an idea of some of the controls that you can certainly put in place against some of these things to help prevent them. And again, terrorism. In this case, for terrorism, disguise operations for secrecy, establish alternative emergency facilities, communicate with law enforcement and government agencies, inform employees potential for terrorism, have crisis response plan, contract for expertise, negotiations, and train employees. So a lot of these things are very similar. All right. So cyber risk exposures. So I think we all recognize nowadays that we're all more dependent on technology and electronic data, which really increases our cyber risk. Whereas before, hey, if we have our records in a file, not a big deal, we've got them. But your main risk there was, okay, if something happens to the building or it catches on fire, I lose all those records. But now with technology, everything's in the cloud. We have data storage. We have people with thumb drives with data, personal identifying information. We hear stories about people's laptops getting stolen because they leave them in the cars or the trunk, and then it has all this data that's not encrypted. Those are all now, whereas before you'd have to have maybe a whole, semi-full of files, that would have all the data. Now it's on a thumb drive, because we have 20 gigabyte thumb drives or whatever, to where you just have tons and tons of information on there. So we talk about cyber risk. It also includes property, net income, and liability loss exposures. There's potential based upon, what type of data, what can happen that produces some of these other types of exposures when we have it. So we talk about property, from a cyber loss exposure standpoint. Property exposed to loss due to cyber risk falls into tangible and intangible property. So I think we recognize tangible would be damage to equipment, software, would be considered tangible because of whether it be hacking or something else to where the computer becomes unusable or the network, the servers become unusable. That would be a damage to equipment. And so even if you have a cyber risk policy, there's damage to the equipment, most likely it'll fall under the property coverage rather than a cyber coverage per se. Theft of money due to cyber attack would be considered a tangible loss. Because there was actually something, physical stolen as part of that. Damage to electronic data may be considered intangible and not covered under policy. However, paper records may be covered as they are tangible. So the idea is now where we used to have everything on pieces of paper, it was tangible. If we lost those records, there might be some value to them. But most policies now don't consider data up in the cloud as being tangible. It's intangible. But it can be converted to tangible. So that's one of the concerns. That's why people really need to look at their policies. Intellectual property, trade secrets, those type of things would be intangible. And also the idea that from an intangible standpoint, cybersecurity attack can harm an organization's reputation if not handled appropriately. So, the reputational risk is really part of that whole area of the intangible. You can't, or copyright and those type of things can be, or trade secrets can be stolen from a hacking. From a net income standpoint, loss exposure may be due to reduction in or cessation of normal business operations, known as business interruption. So the idea is, I think I gave an example, if our revenues, if we're an internet company, and if I'm Amazon, and our servers go down, or where I'm having hosted my servers go down, all that revenue that's lost will be business interruption, and that could be a substantial loss to an organization, especially depending on the time of year. If it's right before Christmas, huge amount of money that could be lost. So that's why it's important to, that's why net income loss can be affected from a cyber risk exposure as well. Some of that can be denial of service attacks, viruses, malware, phishing, getting those type of things, trying to get data from people. The concern, and this is where a lot of small companies, where the good news, if you're using PayPal or those other things, there's usually some in the small print that no one ever reads where they agree to that they're going to abide by the agreement of whatever the use agreement. It probably says something in there about the liability, what the liability of PayPal is. That if there is a theft of data, because within there, if someone was to hack into PayPal, if you think about it, or Amazon, because most likely the credit card numbers are there, all that, there's certain encryption requirements. Actually, I have a friend that works for Wells Fargo, and one of his main job is he basically goes out and looks for, he actually looks to make sure that security is set up for all these different situations, that data is encrypted. He does audits. He does security audits of cyber accounts, and to make sure that before Wells Fargo will allow them to do business because of a certain liability, that they're going to have certain protections in place as part of that. Must also consider impact to organization. If a key supplier has cyber attack issues, how would that affect if they're having problems? And then also consideration of extra cost to bring network back up, or if you totally lose data. How are you going to have that information backed up? Where is it going to be? Especially if you have billing accounts, how are you going to know to send bills out if you lose all of your accounts' receivable data? From a liability standpoint, exposures arise from activities using email, maintaining websites, or developing software and conducting daily business. So how bodily injury might happen. And this is more from the manufacturer of the software. That if in my algorithm it says, people use the software in my website, and someone hacks in and changes the algorithm, and it tells people that they should be mixing, bleach with ammonia for whatever, for this mixture to get stains out or something. Well, of course we know that that's not healthy to be able to breathe in that gas, and then that could be cause. It could be bodily injury because it's on the website. Therefore, the organization is now liable. What it talks about in the textbook is the idea that being vigilant, always looking at what's on your website to make sure it's not outdated and that someone hasn't put something there that is not correct. Or more importantly, if there's coding changes, that's where the quality control is, to make sure what is in the algorithm, there's a certain risk that goes into selling software, especially when it's giving advice or telling people to do something as part of that. Personal and advertising injury liability. So loss exposures include liability resulting from malicious prosecution, slander, libel, defamation, or false advertising. Other types of liability when we talk about. So it goes through a lot of different types of liability that can be part of cyber risk. Intellectual property liability can affect copyrights, trademarks, patents, and trade secrets by posting unauthorized material. So where this liability comes into play is that if I have a website and I'm a company, and I go, oh, that's great, I'm going to go ahead and use that article on my website. Well, if you're not giving proper credit, copyright, then you can be sued under intellectual property liability. Or if you're using someone's trademark or you're using those things without permission, it's usually unknowingly. Obviously, when people do this, they're not realizing what they're doing as part of it. Errors and omissions liability, risk of design errors, manufacturing errors, or service errors may cause lawsuits for not providing the service that was paid for. So when we talk about some of the service errors, that well, here's an example. So I'm providing this course, and I say I'm going to deliver all the chapters, and I say I'm going to skip doing a couple chapters. I don't have the time, or or if I decide I'm not going to re-record the chapter I did. Well, someone could say, well, I didn't provide the service in which they paid for, and then I could be open to a lawsuit. So that's the type of things is making sure that, having errors and omissions to help protect if that was the case. That's where errors and omission coverage would certainly help with that. Risk control, when we talk about controlling and financing some of these things, when we talk about different exposures, the main way we can do this is risk control is really the primary method. While it talks about risk financing, there's not, commercial insurance policies really exclude or restrict cover for cyber risk. They're still going to include provisions for, for, like I said, net income and liability losses and things like that. But for cyber risk specifically, they're most likely going to be excluded. Or it may only include, usually what they have in them now is they'll include provision for notifying those affected by a security breach. They'll say, okay, here's the coverage, and so if someone does get a hold of data, we'll help. The coverage will basically pay for the mailing of notification out to those, which I think many of us at some point have received some notification of some company saying that the security has been breached. We don't know if they have your personal information, but just in case, we're going to go ahead and we're letting you know, and here's a free monitoring service for the next some odd years. Now, those requirements of notification are now in statute, and that's why they need to do those where they weren't necessarily doing those before. So that's much more of a common type of provision there. So when we talk about cyber risk, it's going to be the same procedures. Physical controls, procedural. There's a couple more on here that we didn't have, but personnel, investigation, persecution of cyber crimes, and post-cyber incident rapid recovery program. We'll talk more about that. So what are some of the physical controls when we talk about those? Basic physical protection, guards, locked doors, passwords, and limited access. Screen all new hardware and software for viruses. What's interesting is they talk, from a cyber risk standpoint, they're really talking about the protection of the building and access, which to me seems kind of odd because I think most hackers are not doing it through entering through a building and actually accessing the network. They're doing it remotely. So that's when I'm not sure really comes into play as much as it's really going to be the some of the other passwords and limiting access that way. From a procedural standpoint, limiting access to certain sites. Regular network security updates will be one of the, every month we receive an update of patches, or if there's a more critical one, they'll be sent out sooner. Not allowing software to be installed unless tested and approved. Most organizations, most people don't like the IT department because they say, well, I need to install the software, and they say no. And it's because they want to make sure there's certain software that's approved. The other issue is make sure that there's proper licenses for the software to be used in the first place. And also privacy policy and procedures will probably be part of that as well. So the procedural controls as well, which I know some people that in the class can't access certain sites. So when I was doing like You Send It or other things, a lot of IT companies say, nope, you can't get access because they're concerned about viruses coming out. And doing that, or they limit access to YouTube or Facebook or some other types of things, again, to prevent it. And most companies also have procedures, or whether people follow them or not, of not putting data on flash drives, or at least certain type of data should not be put on flash drives. And if it is, it needs to be encrypted to do so. Personnel controls, similar to what we saw before, pre-employment screening, training, having an acceptable use policy. Most organizations now have an acceptable use policy that says how they can use the computer. That acceptable use within UC, people can check their bank accounts and other stuff, maybe only during certain times, but it's not meant to be that they're going to be on Facebook all day. Termination process includes revoking access and passwords. That's one of the, so from a control standpoint, the only computers that can get on the network are computers that come out of this building. So someone can't say, well, what's the FTP, what's the server so I can get access? They can't get a hold of those shared drives without actually having a computer that comes from them. Managerial controls, the centralizing responsibility for cybersecurity, the development and monitoring of procedures, and again, some of those procedures use of flash drives, and the cloud for storing and sharing files. Again, the cloud is becoming much more of an issue for most organizations of what should be allowed there because especially being in a university, we have Lawrence Berkeley National Lab as part of that. If there's information being stored in the cloud, wouldn't a terrorist like to know what things are being there? Be able to hack into some of those things, and they may not have proper security. by just have a file, a Google Drive, it may not have the proper protections in place. Investigation and prosecution of cybercrimes. A lot of times there's concern about the public perception, but really what, if there's not sometimes more of an open showing vigilance in that protection, you're more likely to have even more targets come that way. So, the text really talks about that being a part of it. Post-cyber incident rapid recovery program. The idea is that under a cyber risk program, you want to have really guidelines and backups, and this is where risk control becomes really vital. It will help aid reducing severity and helps restore functionality as soon as possible, and focus on ability to preserve and sustain its net income in the event of a cyber loss. So the idea is with the incident rapid recovery program, at least what they call it, really is, I would call it business continuity, for lack of a better term, is making sure that if something was to happen, you have your backups, you can move to a different site, you can be back up and running in a very short amount of time, and you're not going to be down for days at a time because of the revenue. Also, that from that standpoint, all your data gets backed up. I know there's a facility somewhere up in the Sierras, an undisclosed location, that's basically it's a data storage area. It's away from, it's a major fire-resistant concrete building, so it can't really, from a fire standpoint, there's really not a lot of earthquake danger. They've got a whole bunch of backups from an electrical standpoint, generators and things like that. And so it's meant to be, it's like, trying to think of the right, where the gold's being stored, but Fort Knox. Fort Knox, thank you. So Fort Knox type of data storage is essentially the idea behind it. This is probably an easy way of, idea of, here's the most effective technology against cyber criminals. The use of firewalls, access controls, network-based policy enforcement, and you kind of see what most locations are doing. This is back from 2007. So from an insurance standpoint, so cyber risk insurance coverage is still evolving. There really isn't still much out there. Insurance can be used for property, net income, or liability losses. So even though the cyber risk might be more specific to that aspect, you're still going to have the other policies that will help protect you. Now, one of the things I put a link in here for those that are interested is that UC really probably was really developed the very first of its kind, a reverse underwriting cyber risk insurance policy, and that was really due to the lack of products in the market. And so we actually went to, I think it was Lloyd's, as part of the process, and now we have a means to do that. So what does reverse underwriting mean is that in order to have coverage, we basically obligate ourselves to follow certain security requirements to say, here's our guidelines. In order to even present a claim, we have to, have all these things in place. So it really puts out in front that for our IT, shops within the various campuses, those locations, to really institute those best practices to make sure that we would have coverage in those situations. And here I did the cut and paste at least on one of the things that talks, the reality check, the cost of data breaches. Again, whether it's theft or damage, just the resulting, aspect of that. But, company, for example, in the case in 2007, data breach at TJX companies paid in addition to other large losses, $9.75 million to settle claims from 41 state attorneys general relating to the failure to adequately safeguard customers' financial information. So just a huge aspect. And if you, from a university standpoint, whether it be payroll data, or if it's the hospital standpoint with all the personal information, medical information, that can be certainly a huge aspect for it. So some of the other things that from, there's non-insurance risk transfer that can be taken care of. And when we think about that, there's hold harmless and indemnity agreements that can be used to receive reimbursements for cyber risk losses or to transfer the cyber risk loss exposure. So some of the web hosting agreements they'll actually have in place that they will pay the retailer for losses due to server failures resulting in lost sales for the retailer. That might be one of the transfers that might be in place. But again, that's where that small print is. But a lot of times what they'll do is they'll put a liability disclaimer to really limit the amount. So they might say they'll do it up to a certain amount, which limits their liability. or a lot of software companies, I think I mentioned in the past, will basically say our liability is limited to what you purchased the software for. Okay, so if you paid $1,000 for the software, that's the most of liability. So if you use QuickBooks to do bookkeeping and something happened, that $100 you might have paid for the software, that's their liability. It's not, if something happened, it's not their problem. Now, part of that liability, they'll usually have some type of electronic signature to indicate consent. You either check a box, you put your initials in there, you click the button that says, yes, I agree. All those things are a way to basically, that's their liability disclaimer that says that you've agreed that you read all the small print, which no one really does. They click the button, but you've essentially agreed to all that, and by doing so. Or in some cases, by the fact that you're using the site, whether it be Facebook, they change their privacy policy. They send a notification out, and they say, okay, if you want to continue using the site, you basically are agreeing. If you post more pictures up, you've agreed to those measures. The other aspect that you can do is retention, where basically they're financing the losses, the cyber risk loss exposures. Retention, in most parts, when you retain risk and you're going to be paying out of your own dollars, it usually encourages better risk control because it's coming out of the profits or the bottom line of the organization. But the problem is, if you have one big loss, it could completely wipe out any type of profit. And so most likely there's still going to be some type of purchase of some high deductible program or something that will help protect the organization from those big losses. So moving on to social media risk. So I think most of us are aware of social media, whether it be Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Vine, I think what else, LinkedIn. Foursquare. There's all these things out there that we didn't have before. But the thing about social media allows two-way communication with customers, potential customers. It's created a very, you want to call it a fast news cycle. That information gets out very, very quickly. A lot of wrong information gets out very, very quickly. So it provides a means to disseminate information and provide feedback. Organizations can also monitor public perception of products and services. They're launching new information this way if you become a follower of some of these different sites. But just as much negative comments can spread quickly, and the ability, when part of this is from a risk management standpoint, is having the means to respond quickly to either bad news or some other type of events, because the reality is it could also affect stock prices. People all of a sudden they decide to sell their stock because of what was put on Facebook or some other type of social media site. So some of the risks, obviously, we're going to talk about. We're going to go through some of these, but reputation risk is probably one of the bigger elements. The idea that a single negative comment, even if it's not true, can reverse an organization's positive image and damage reputation in a matter of hours or minutes. I'm trying to think of some examples where bad information went out, but usually it's involving the stocks, where you usually hear about something where it necessarily wasn't true, and obviously having to deal with some of those things.
Restaurants seem susceptible to reputation risk for service.
Yeah, so actually that's a good example. So I mentioned actually Yelp a little bit later on, but Yelp and TripAdvisor or some of those other things where people give reviews, that could be it's, whereas at Facebook, depending on so if I do a review on Yelp, it's a little bit more controlled, because I'm going to hopefully put stars and all that. Whereas with Facebook, if I do that same review and I can say what a bad horrible place this is, and then you start perpetuating it, it can reach, or if you have Twitter and you have all these followers, it certainly have an impact. Or I think what the issue has been where people have claimed their site has been hacked. Originally Anthony Weiner said his site was hacked supposedly, but that can certainly again have an impact there. Let's be aware of employee behavior and comments posted on social media, because it can impact an organization.
Domino's got hit badly with that, with employees doing inappropriate things with ingredients and taking pictures of it.
Yeah, okay, good. There's the example, and well, that's the other thing is that now the idea that there's video cameras everywhere. I think there was a video posted of a FedEx person throwing packages in the back of the truck, and then the other guy started getting on it, and so we have that. We have the ridiculous. My son loves watching Ridiculousness, I think it's called, on MTV, and they show a lot of these bad behaviors essentially as part of it. But again, all these things are now being posted because everyone has a camera, or with understanding that police. There is now a movement with police officers. I think there was a request even for UC, the idea of having individual cameras for police officers, because it can it protects the police officer if they get accused of not doing something properly, but also because there's so many cameras around. The Meserly, that was caught, all the people that had cameras, that was posted. Even though I never knew what twerking was until, the VMA Awards, but the whole thing with Miley Cyrus, obviously that spread like wildfire. So all these things move rather quickly and have how many millions of views actually can be part of it. So some of the risks there involving social media. So we have, as part of that, legal risk. So some social media activities can lead to lawsuits or persecution for violation of the law, and can arise from employment or security practices. The employment risks: personnel information about employees, potential employees, is readily available. So the idea is that if I think I mentioned college applicants or other types of things that if I want to hire someone, if I can Google their name and I might get their Facebook page and I can see that they're out last night and all the pictures are up of them drinking. I'll see that. Whether you want to hire this person. Universities, I know a lot of times they'll look at Facebook pages or other things that are, determine, is this a person that I want to have be part of our university system, be on our campus to represent. So, but even with that information, that hire decisions, there's a liability for the company because, they're basing that decision, what are they basing on? But they, even with all that, they can't base on race, age, disability, or religion, or other protected classes. And also the idea that some speech may be protected on social media sites, and organizations may not be able to discipline or terminate employees for comments. So it depends on if they're publishing on your own Facebook page, you can discipline someone, but people still have free speech rights. And so there's certain speech that will certainly still be protected in most cases. From security risks, employees may reveal confidential information, inadvertently saying, hey, I'm working on this special project that's doing blah, 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 blah. Well, things are in development. They, that's something that, confidentially, they may have signed some agreement where they can't discuss those. Actually, this is probably more common, revealing travel plans or social events may invite criminal activity. That's one thing I am very particular about, is that I see a lot of people put on there that they're going to take a trip wherever. Well, they just invite to say, hey, no one's home, have at it. Or so one of the things when I take travel, when I'm on travel, typically, I wait till I get back to posting any pictures. That's just one of the things that because I don't, like I said, it's an invitation to people, possibly. Intellectual property risk. Posting of copyrighted material without proper notices may cause copyright infringement. We kind of talked about that earlier. Defamation. Putting remarks about a competitor's product could be held for liable comments. Product or restaurant reviews. We kind of mentioned Yelp being used by competitors. One of the things that's coming out is that what they're finding is some bad reviews are basically from competition writing bad reviews so people won't go there. And so they're not real ones, or paying people to give positive reviews. So some of these organizations are having the employees write the reviews. So, the idea of fake reviews is becoming more of a problem on some of these sites. Privacy risks. Reading electronic communications is protected under some circumstances. It depends on usually with the employment practices of what the policy procedures are. Most organizations say that we have a right to review your emails because it's being stored on, you're using our computers, it's on our network, and for the most part, they can read emails that are part of the domain, but they would not be allowed to read emails that were from Google or other things if you had a different email account. Same time, employers have no right to control what employees post on their private accounts. I think it's important to know. And cannot use photo or personal information on social website for commercial purposes without permission. So the idea of even if someone posted information, yes, it's on Facebook, but that gives me no right to take that picture and say, I'm going to use that picture for publication. As a matter of fact, I have a friend that's a photographer, a professional photographer that does weddings, and ended up using some of her pictures on someone else's website, and they're like, wait, this is, that's her property that they're using to try to promote their business, and which they didn't take. Operational risks. Social network users can be vulnerable to malware that may infect the network. As well as if breach occurs, organizations can be held liable for failing to protect the client's or customer's personnel information. So again, that's where the, and this is where the password issues become part of the problem. So what can you do? How do you control social media risk? Really begin with the assessment of what the risk is. What are the challenges of what you need to look at? Designate a person with authority to communicate online on behalf of the organization. So the idea is that, basically you instruct employees that if something happens, they're not to talk about this. Only that this person is authorized to be the spokesperson, just like they do for other media. This is the person who will do that. Prohibit all employees from using social media at work or limit access to certain websites. So that way, because one of the concerns is that, and unfortunately I see people like posting stuff, like those are work hours. Why are they posting stuff on a social media site, which then someone can make the claim of, from Open Records Act or some other type of thing saying, okay, this is being conducted during business. This becomes something that might be discoverable of what they're trying to do. And also adopt guidelines and acceptable use. And I know for UC and most other organizations, that's really become a common practice of what acceptable use is, how they can use the computers, what sites they can access, those type of things, and what's considered private and what's not private when using the system.
Like you just mentioned, I think it's commonly known that employers have the right to review email on their domains, I believe, and then certainly control websites that employees visit and log that. Do they have the right to log basically keystrokes? I don't recall one way or another on that.
That one I'm not sure. So the question was whether the right to have certain aspects, but can they do keystrokes? Now, one of the concerns, so one of the software that we have is an online ergonomic software, which helps. It doesn't log specific keystrokes. It logs a number of keys per minute or per hour. The idea being that at some point people need to do an exercise or take a break. But the question did come up by someone saying, "Hey, is this log keystrokes?" And we double checked, it didn't. But I'm not sure. I mean, I think I've heard of, for some reason, I seem to remember there's some court cases where, or some challenge where a company was doing something like that. And I mean, see, I do know from working in other companies that at any point in time they could see exactly what's on your computer live.
Right.
So, and certain organizations do that. I think it really depends on the organization and what they put in writing and what their policies are. A lot of them, there's some policies that are very strict, saying we have the right to view what's on your screen, to do all these things, and they have to notify the employees that essentially they have no privacy when they are here. That's part of it. If they don't notify, then they can't do it. So I think as long as they do a notification, I think that's part of it. And it looks like we do have someone with a comment here. So, so it looks like Bob. Looks you put a.
Number key.
You must be hitting the number key there. I don't know if that's the policy number or not. There we go. Okay, thanks, Bob. All right. So that might be part of it there. And then here's some other examples, some guidelines that you might put in place as far as an acceptable use policy. Comments about the organization's products or services should not be posted anonymously. Unless authorized to do so, individuals should avoid any implication that they represent the organization. Anything posted in any social media form should be considered public information. So the idea is, hey, if you're posting this stuff on a, again, can be part of it. You should be cautious about sharing company information. Clients and customer privacy should be protected. You shouldn't say, hey, I'm working for such and such company. You're doing a project at such and such. Human rights and intellectual property rights violations should be avoided. Any material posted should be accurate, not defamatory, fraudulent, or misleading. and work-related posts should be maintained in professional tone. So the idea of, hey, I'm at a conference of whatever, and then there's pictures of doing, dancing on a beer, on a bar table, something. I mean, unfortunately, RIMS and insurance conferences are probably notorious for doing things like that.
I remember seeing an article about I think it was a professor at some university, not UC, thank goodness, who went to a professional conference and while he was there tweeted basically, why aren't there any good-looking women here?
So yeah,
And
that could be part of it. So
did not go over well.
yeah. So so the main gist on this chapter that I would get, I mean, from a high-level standpoint, you're starting to hopefully see the trend of tort statutes and some of the different aspects. How do you protect, the questions that you're going to get on the exam are going to be at a higher level of, if you had this type of exposure, there's going to be scenario-based questions. What would be the best protection to put in place if you had a warehouse environment, those type of things? What would be some of the considerations to protect against burglary? And most likely there's going to be choices of, most likely physical controls, those type of things are going to be part of that. Or it's going to say which one of these would be considered a procedural, method to prevent, or to deter or detect. So it's going to be really at the high level. It's going to be more scenario-based. And then same thing with the cyber risk. I would expect the social media being a new section that they didn't have, expects at least 1 or 2 questions on social media risk of how you might want to respond to some of those. So for once, we've actually ended on time, which is good. We will be doing another class the following, tomorrow night, and that will be the last chapter, which we will be covering fleet risk. And then the following week, we will be doing the final review of all the chapters, and in that, for those that did the other one, 54, really be highlighting what areas do you want to concentrate on that you're most likely, that you probably want to study a little bit more than others, where you're more likely to get those type of questions. So with that, look forward to tomorrow night, and thanks for everyone for joining.